We're thrilled to have Dean Spears and Michael Geruso here today to talk about their book, After the Spike. I think it's a very important and a timely book, and they do the hard work of bringing rigorous evidence to make the case for why we should care about global population decline. So I'm excited to have this conversation today. And then if you don't believe me, there's many other people far more distinguished on the back of this book giving some praise. So I'm excited for this conversation. I think we can get started. Michael Geruso is going to do a little bit of a presentation laying out the data and the case in the book, and then him and Dean will sit down with our director, Melissa Kearney, for a short conversation afterwards. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thanks for having us to talk about our new book, After the Spike, Population Progress and the Case for People. I want to start by backing up a bit from the news about birth rates in the last couple of years or just in the United States, and take a little bit of a longer term and broader vision of the global population. So living in a big populous world is a relatively new phenomenon. 10,000 years ago, there were maybe 5 million people on the planet, all told, the size of a large city like Atlanta. It wasn't until 1800 or so that we passed 1 billion people for the first time. And then in the century that followed, from 1800 to 1925, the population doubled to 2 billion. And since then, in the last century, the population has doubled and doubled again to our present 8.2 billion. And so here's where we are in human history, a sort of anomaly of living in a big populous world. What all the groups that do demographic forecasting and projections project for the next few decades is that the global population growth will slow and will peak. So that peak might come in the 2080s, according to the United Nations projections. It might come in the 2060s, according to the group of demographers at the University of Washington. It might come in the 2070s, according to the group of demographers at the Institute for Advanced Systems Analysis in Vienna. But what all of these groups agree on is that, and what basically every demography projection agrees on, is that the most likely future is we peak within the next few decades. To answer what comes after that peak, you need to take some sort of stand on what birth rates might be in the future beyond that. And so I'm going to show you that the picture that I'm going to sketch for you is pretty robust to many different assumptions about what the future might hold. But just for the sake of illustration, let's imagine that the world as a whole converged to a birth rate that would feel very familiar to all of us in this room, a birth rate of 1.6 kids for every 2 adults. What that sort of, and that happens to be the birth rate of the United States today, what that sort of future would mean is rapid global depopulation. So, over the last 2 centuries, the global population has spiked up. The pace of decline could be just as fast on the downslope with the sort of families that feel normal today. Many people having 2 kids, some people having 0, some people having 1, some people having 3 or more. So that sort of familiar, normal feeling present would lead to this profoundly different future. So the natural question to ask is that kind of future likely? And one of the things we do in the book is make the case that yes, that kind of future is quite likely. Here's one piece of evidence that can help give a sense of why you might think that kind of future is likely. If you look at what's happened, not just in the United States, not just in the richer corners of the world, or not just in those places plus a few countries in Southeast Asia, but in the world overall, over the last 75 years, we've gone from a world in which most countries had above replacement birth rates. So by above replacement, I mean 2 kids in the next generation to replace 2 parents in the prior generation. That would mean a stable population, either growing or shrinking over time. We've fallen across that threshold in most places on Earth. So, I know that birth rates in the last couple of years have gotten a lot of attention in U.S. media, but let's just be very clear, this is not a U.S. phenomenon, or not only a U.S. phenomenon. So Mexico has a lower birth rate than the United States. Colombia has a lower birth rate than the United States. Chile, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Iran. This is a globally convergent phenomenon in the secular and religious corners of the world. Basically, every region on Earth other than sub-Saharan Africa is a below replacement region. And today, 2/3 of people on Earth live in a country below the replacement level of 2 kids per 2 adults. Even India, so India was this center of fears and fear-mongering and doomerism about overpopulation in the 1960s, 1970s. India is a place today that is below the replacement threshold. And if you look at what young women report to surveyors in India today, even relatively poor young women in India, they're seeking families that are less than 2 kids on average. So that's one reason why we should think that persistent low fertility is not a guaranteed future, but a very likely future that we should take seriously. Another reasonable question to ask here is, well, what if you're wrong? What if birth rates, don't converge to something like 1.6 for the world overall? What if they converge to something else? It turns out that you can be off in your beliefs or your assumptions or your projections about what will happen to global average fertility over the long run by quite a bit and reach the same conclusion. So whether you think that birth rates might converge to something quite low, like 1 kid per 2 adults, like China, Colombia, Chile today, or something like 1.4 or 1.6 or 1.8. 1.8 is the average in Latin America overall. It also happens to be the birth rate in Texas, where Dean and I teach. Any of those futures would lead to this unfamiliar future of rapid global depopulation. It's one thing to look at a picture where the timescale goes from 2000 BCE to today. We can zoom in a little bit to make this a bit more granular and real feeling. To think about how fast change would come, you could consider a birth rate of something like, we're going to use China or Colombia or Chile, a birth rate of 1 kid per 2 adults, because that's going to make the math a little bit easier, but then we'll zoom out to thinking about a birth rate that's closer to the United States. A birth rate of 1 kid per 2 adults means that in a first generation, there might be 100 people. In the next generation, those 1 kids per 2 adults would mean 50 people in the next generation, and then age that forward 1 more generation, 25 kids in the 3rd generation. So within 3 generations, so maybe 60 years separating them, you have cohort sizes that go from 100 to 25, or 75% decline. What does that look like if you take a birth rate like 1.5, which is a little bit lower than the US today, a little bit higher than Europe? If you take the average over the 115 or so richest countries of the world, that average birth rate is 1.5. What that would look like is first noticing that 1.5 is 75% of 2 or 2.1, the replacement level. What that would mean is that in the 2nd generation, there would be 75 people for 100 in the 1st generation. And by the 3rd generation, it would fall to almost half, about 55 people. So even with these birth rates that would just feel so familiar to us today, that will lead to this profoundly different future, and it would happen quite fast, within just a few generations once we turn the corner from population growth to population decline. And in calendar time, to bring this back to calendar time rather than the size of cohorts across generations, to do that, you need to do something a little bit more careful. You need to do some cohort component modeling in demographic science to track people as they age and die. So you're not just thinking about the size of a cohort that's born, but you think about the size of the population that continues to exist and ages through their life course. And if you do that exercise, which Dean and I have done, you get something like a 2/3 decline in the size of the global population every century. That's about 10% every decade. And so this decline just could come much faster than I think is on the minds of anyone today. And one of the things we're trying to do with the book is raise awareness of this. So in the book, we make 3 big claims. The first big claim is something that I've already spent some time talking about today, which is that no future today is more likely than a world where global depopulation is coming. That means decline generation after generation, decade after decade. That's what would arrive from birth rates that are normal today in most of the world. The second big claim of the book, and where we spend a lot of time in the book, is thinking through what would the consequences of population decline be. Is that something we should welcome? Is it something that we should work against? Is it something we should hope for something different to happen, like a stable population, neither growing nor shrinking over the long run? And there, we tally the evidence from climate, from thinking about the consequences for gender equity, thinking about the consequences for material well-being? Are more people a reason to expect each of us to get less? Are we dividing up the world more thinly? Or is there something that we benefit from living in a big world? And not to hide the ball, we think that there's, overall and all things considered, we should want to avoid global depopulation. Not necessarily to hope for a population that grows and grows forever and ever, but stabilizing rather than declining indefinitely. And the last big claim of the book is that nobody yet knows how to reverse the decline. Nobody yet knows how to stabilize the population. Nobody yet knows how to raise birth rates. Not governments, not researchers. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it does mean that we have a lot of work to do if that's something that, on the whole, societies choose to do. So in the book, to illustrate the consequences of depopulation versus an alternative, we often compare two categories of possibilities for the future. The first is depopulation. That's the lowest line on the graph that you're seeing, and that's just a zoomed-in version of the figure that I've already shown you. The other class of possibilities is population stabilization, that at some point over the long run, and not in every country or every decade, but over the long run and globally, that we averaged out to something like 2 kids per 2 adults. So the population stabilizes, neither growing nor shrinking. Now, whether that happens at a high level, somewhere near the peak, 8 billion people, 10 billion people, or something much smaller than today, 4 billion people, 2 billion people, what defines stabilization in our book and in our analysis is just that it's differentiated from unending population decline. And that's what we're arguing for, is stabilizing at some level. What's interesting, and I think is underappreciated, is that for the world to stabilize at any level, even a much smaller population than today, birth rates would eventually have to rise. Because whether your population is huge or tiny, if the next generation is smaller than last, then it will continue to shrink. And so just to underscore that, if you hope for a stable global population at any level, even if you were to adopt this sort of 1960s, 1970s environmentalism that called for zero population growth. Zero population growth is just another word for stabilization. If that's what you'd want at a smaller population today, at 4 billion people, half of today's population, then you implicitly want at some point for birth rates to rise. And as I said, no one yet knows how to achieve that. One thing I haven't said yet is why anyone should care about this in the first place. And so part of what we do in the book is we make the case for people. We ask, why should we care? We say that we should want to avoid depopulation. And a world that falls by 2/3 of its population every century is not something we should shrug off. That would be a profoundly different future, and it's not something that we should be complacent about heading towards. Oops. One reason to want to avoid depopulation is that people matter for themselves. Another reason is that people matter for one another. We are better off getting to live in a big populous world than people who lived a couple decades or a couple centuries ago. The progress that other people have made, the benefits of scale that we all get to enjoy is not something that we should be happy to leave behind. And just to be clear, what we're saying here is going beyond concerns about funding pension systems or worker shortages or fiscal imbalances of governments. Those things matter. They're not the case for people that we make in the book, in part because, wonky people like the people in this room are already attending to those sorts of concerns. There's no shortage of finance ministers in Europe or treasury secretaries in the United States that aren't concerned about the solvency of things like Social Security. Right? But we think that as important as it is not the biggest reason to care about the future of the population. And to drill down on that a little bit, one of the things we say is that progress doesn't happen automatically. It takes people to achieve it. It would be quite a coincidence if the same narrow slice in history, where in humanity's 100,000-year history, when the world got rich, if that just happened to be for completely coincidental reasons, the same narrow slice of human history in the last couple hundred years when the population spiked upwards. It's not a coincidence. And macroeconomics gives us a couple of reasons to understand why a populous world is a more prosperous world with better lives on average for everybody. The first is non-rival innovation. It's that ideas are a special kind of resource that's completely renewable, that don't get diminished when they are used. So, when you take an antibiotic pill, only one person can ever take that pill. Once it's consumed, it's gone forever. But the formula for the pill, the knowledge of the production process for how to make the antibiotic pill, and the underlying germ theory of disease to help us understand what a bacterial infection is in the first place, those things remain undiminished to be used over and over and over again. And it's not just cures for diseases, it's everything from organizing a construction crew to organizing a kindergarten. We get to live better lives and expect more out of life because of the progress that other people have made. So that's one category of reasons. Another category of reasons to not be complacent about population decline is that contemporaneously we benefit from living in a big world with many other people. So sometimes we think about people as competition for getting what we want. We think that it's very natural. Many of us have this thought that another person is competition for a job, for a parking spot, for housing. But in the grandest picture and over the long run, other people are not a source of competition. They're a source of abundance. If what you want is a cure for a niche medical condition, a rare medical condition, you should be happy that other people have that same need. If what you want is a revolution in green energy, you should be happy that other people want that and that the market is large enough to support the innovation and the production to produce the next generation of solar panels, to produce the next iteration in geothermal energy. Another thing we spend a lot of time talking about in the book, and I'll just give a little taste of it here, is the idea that we should count on automatic stabilizers, that at some point, when things get really bad, things will turn around. And one thing that I think connects to a common concern or a common explanation for why birth rates are low in the United States and elsewhere is that parenting is unaffordable, right? So I think it's really hard to look at the evidence of the gains in incomes and economic security over the last decades or centuries and think that the reason that people aren't having children is that they're no longer affordable. But let's just be very clear. Rising incomes, less economic precarity, more opportunities for people are not going to drive birth rates up. The pattern historically has been exactly the opposite. As people have more economic security, as incomes rise, birth rates in every region of the world have fallen. So that's not going to be something that automatically turns things around if people become richer. Another thing that we sometimes hear is that once this really becomes a problem, once low birth rates really start to bite, governments will step in and turn things around. The record is that governments really do not have, there's no reason to think that governments will be able to do that. The track record is quite poor. Governments don't know how to raise birth rates. Researchers don't have policy prescriptions that have ever worked to raise birth rates up back to a replacement level after they've fallen below it. And a stat here that I think is compelling for us as we were doing this research is that since 1950, there have been 26 countries in which the cohort birth rate, so cohort means over a person's entire lifetime, where the cohort birth rate has ever fallen below 1.9 in the countries with good data on cohort birth rates. In 0 for 26 of those countries have cohort birth rates ever yet risen back above 2 after falling below 1.9. Now, that's not a guarantee that it could never happen, and we wouldn't have written this book if we thought there was nothing that anyone could do in the future to change things. But I think it's a very clear indication that we should not expect change to come automatically. These are countries where low fertility had been low since the 1970s in some cases, in Japan and Canada. Nothing that governments have done in any country where fertility has fallen low has ever risen fertility back up to replacement levels. Another thing we talk about in the book is whether reversing course would mean backsliding on gender equity. Would it be the case that if birth rates were to rise back up to 2 in places where it's fallen below 2, that would mean a special sacrifice on the part of women in particular, or some sort of backsliding on the cultural, political, social progress that societies have made for gender equity? I think that question, in some sense, comes from a mistaken premise that we don't endorse, which is that we don't think that children are women's responsibility. We think that we all benefit from getting to live in a big world, and that means we should all share in that responsibility of creating the next generation. So we don't want to start from that faulty premise that that it would mean worse lives for women because children are women's responsibility. We don't think that's the case. And so that's a sort of normative case that we make. Practically, for there to be about 2 kids on average per 2 adults, that'd be something that people would have to choose. And we don't really see a path to people choosing that if what we're doing is taking away opportunities from people or making life worse for mothers or worse for fathers, for that matter. The way that we endorse in the book of moving forward is to change the ability of people, of men and women, to combine childbearing and family life with everything else that matters to them, with career, with education, with relationships outside of their family. Okay, so just to conclude, what now? The goal in the book is to try to sound a wake-up call that this is an issue that we should be taking seriously now. And part of the reason we should be taking it seriously now is that we're very far away from having any answer to how to deal with this. There's no program or policy or piece of legislation that's going to turn birth rates around on a dime. I think history has shown us that quite clearly, and maybe we can talk about that in the discussion if you all like. But we're also decades away from actually hitting the peak of population. So we have time to learn. And we should be using that time to learn and invest research careers, invest attention, invest in changing the conversations that people are having around population, and to have those be more informed conversations. One thing we didn't talk about here, but maybe we'll talk about in the Q&A, is the idea that people are bad for each other, bad for the planet. And I think those are, part of the conversation that needs to happen is a reevaluation in light of the evidence of what we actually know about what people, the way that other people improve the quality of lives of each of us. So maybe that's a good place to transition to a conversation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Mike, and thank you both for being with us this morning. Thanks, everyone, for coming out to talk about this. I'm super excited about this book. I think it's a really, really important book, and I hope it is the wake-up call that you all are intending. I'll just start with probably the most obvious reaction that I expect you'll get, that certainly I get whenever I bring up the issue of population, which is, guys, for years, decades, we've been told that population growth was a problem, right? There are organizations and movements and advocacy groups committed to population control, population stabilization. Certainly all of us who went to school in the 80s and 90s learned about this. Lots of kids are still hearing this in school today. I think a lot of this is the legacy of Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb. This idea has a really strong hold on a lot of people. And so my question for you is, why all of a sudden the whiplash? Were we too successful at controlling, stabilizing population that we've overcorrected, and now this is all a very, humanity's existence depends on a very calibrated refinement. We had too many, now we have too few, we've got to go back? Or do you think Paul Ehrlich's warnings were wrong in the first place? Was that whole movement of the past 40 to 50 years of population stabilization wrong?
So, first of all, thanks so much for having us. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to our organizers, and thanks for that great question. I think Yeah, so for folks who don't know, in 1968, Paul Ehrlich published the book, The Population Bomb, and the cover said something like, population control or race to oblivion. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. It's too late to avoid a terrible catastrophe of mass starvation or something like that. And of course, mass starvation isn't what's happened in the decades since then. There's poverty rates around the world have fallen so fast that even though the size of the population has been growing, the number of people who are poor has been falling, and there's more and better food available on every continent. Children are growing healthier and taller, and mortality rates are falling. So how should we think about that? I mean, one thing that narrative, one thing that happened is that story just missed that humanity even then wasn't on a path to population growth generation after generation forever without any sort of end. In 1968, by I guess Ehrlich's bad luck, turned out to be the year in which the pace of world population growth was the fastest that it ever was. So every year since 1968, the population's been growing more slowly than it was then. And I think people are only now in the United States talking about low birth rates and falling birth rates. But in fact, falling birth rates have been around for a long time. So one of the things that we're trying to say in this book is not only, as Mike said, is this not just a US phenomenon, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's also a phenomenon that's been spread over time for a long time. So as long as population scientists have records, birth rates have been falling in the 19th century, falling in the 20th century, and falling, yes, even in 1968. So, in the next decade, in the 1970s, many countries already had birth rates falling below this 2 kids per 2 adults barrier. Europe did, Australia did, Cuba did, Japan did, and by 1980, a fifth of people lived in a country where the birth rate was already below 2. So, there's a lot we could say, including about the consequences of people, but I guess what I'm really trying to say is we shouldn't treat this as necessarily such a surprise that from where we are right now, global depopulation is the most likely future. There's been evidence of it for a long time because birth rates have been falling for a long time.
What about the environmental degradation? I mean, you guys are going to have a hard time convincing, I think, that world that actually people aren't so bad for the planet, or this isn't the path towards saving the planet. What's your response to that line of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, yes, people have caused a lot of environmental problems, and yes, people do pollute, and yes, people have harmed the planet, and we've all participated in those processes that harm the planet. And it would be silly to deny that. I think the question that we need to ask from where we are right now is whether a smaller population is going to be the solution to those challenges, and in particular, whether depopulation, starting the UN projects at 6 decades from now, maybe it's not exactly that, is going to be what gets us off the hook for our urgent environmental challenges. I mean, one thing to keep in mind, so should we welcome depopulation for its environmental solutions? Well, we can learn from how humanity has responded to other environmental challenges in the past and made progress against other environmental challenges in the past. And so, one important case that I think about a lot because of my time living in India and Asia is air pollution, particulate air pollution. In 2013, the particulate air pollution in China was truly terrible. So newspapers around the world called it the air apocalypse. It's these little particles in the air that are very bad for children's growth and development, bad for older adult mortality. And the U.S. Embassy said it was something like 700 on a scale of 0 to 500. And so what happened next after the 2013 air apocalypse? We sort of stopped hearing about it. And one thing that happened in the next decade is that the size of the population in China grew by 50 million people. And 50 million people is a lot. That's the population of Spain or 1.5 Texases, right? So if more people are always more environmental challenges, we would have expected the particulate air pollution in China to get a lot worse. But in fact, particle air pollution in China fell by half over the following decade. And it's not just China. The world as a whole grew by 750 million people, and particle air pollution got better. Not everywhere. It's still pretty bad in India. But the point being, even though there were more people, the environmental damage was lessened because people did something different. New regulation, new enforcement, turning off coal plants, not necessarily inventing new technology in the case of China, but bringing society closer to the technological frontier of what other people were doing. People making different decisions resulted in less pollution. And every time we've made progress against our environmental challenges before, that's been how we've done it. So in the 80s, it was the hole in the ozone layer, right? And people using chlorofluorocarbon, CFCs, that destroyed the ozone. And a new kid today doesn't make that challenge worse because we don't use CFCs anymore, right? The Montreal Protocol banned that. We in the 70s, it was leaded gasoline, but the Clean Air Act addressed that in the U.S. In the 90s, it was acid rain, but the amendments to the Clean Air Act addressed sulfur dioxide. We have made progress against our environmental challenges before. It's never been by shrinking the population. It's by changing the footprint of what people do. And so, especially since depopulation isn't coming for decades, we shouldn't think that it's going to be the solution to our climate challenges today. Instead, what we need to do today is decarbonize.
I mean, what I hear you saying relates to Mike's point that people come up with non-rivalrous ideas. Mm-hmm. And so you're like, people come up with the ideas on how to solve these problems. And so people are sort of our best hope for coming up with greener technologies and reducing our...
Yes, that makes sense. But I also want to say, even if we never had another idea, right, it would still be the case that the population is a big ship that's slow to turn. Yeah. And so we just shouldn't think that, if a baby's born today, they're going to be deciding whether or not to have another kid, maybe 30 years from now, maybe some other time. But 30 years from now is pretty late relative to our, urgent decarbonization targets. And so,
So the timing of the population crisis,
one question is, if we
different.
hadn't had the same human population all along, might we be facing a different types of environmental challenges now? But in some sense, that question is just irrelevant to the practical challenge that we do face, and it's a disrespect of the importance of the climate crisis to think that depopulation 6 decades from now is going to be a solution.
Fascinating. Okay. You guys, I hope you think this is fair. You're not really alarmist by demeanor, but when I read your book, I'm like, holy crap, we're going extinct. Why are people not freaking out? And even setting aside the folks who actually think population is bad, I think some of the sort of complacency is those fertility projections are always wrong. The UN is always wrong. You guys didn't even know fertility was going to fall this rapidly everywhere. So you know what? Like, maybe your projections are wrong and it's going to come back up. And like, there's just so much uncertainty. I'm not going to set my hair on fire about this. Why is that view wrong?
We don't want anyone to set their hair on fire.
Well, but maybe a little bit if we are going extinct.
I think there's sort of like two levels at which we might be wrong, right? So one level at which you might be wrong is might be wrong about like the particular path that birth rates follow in the next 50, 100 years, and so on. I guess another way we could be wrong is that things could just change. Birth rates could, not a question of whether birth rates converge to 1.8 or 1.6, but that they rebound above 2. So first of all, it's a totally fair question. I think the way that we think about it is that global depopulation, sustained low fertility, is a risk. It's a risk we should take seriously. It's not a guarantee. And there's lots of reasons to think that that risk is quite likely, given, again, something I don't think we've exactly hit on yet, which is that birth rates have been falling for a very long time. But for a very long time, I don't mean years, I don't mean decades, I mean centuries. And the reason that the global population has spiked up in the past couple of centuries is not because birth rates were rising. They weren't, they were falling. It's because we learned how to keep children alive. So more people who were born survived to become adults to have their own children. So this is such a long-term trend. I think that's one reason to think that global depopulation is likely. I think another way that is helpful for me to think and talk about it is that sometimes you can hear all this and think, yeah, but birth rates aren't going to keep falling. And you don't know that birth rates are going to keep falling. And I think that's right. I think the thing that's maybe hard to really internalize is that birth rates wouldn't need to keep falling in places where they are low. They would just need to stay at a level like today's. And so then I think the question is, could they stay at a level like today's? If you were to ask, if we saw college tuition increasing by 10% every year, we would know that that's an unsustainable trend. Something's going to break. It's going to kick us off that path. I don't think the same thing is true when thinking about global depopulation, because all that would need to happen is that for many generations, people would look around at the world that they're living in, at their opportunities for education, for employment, about the kind of lives they want to build for themselves, and decide that a lot of people could decide they want to have 2 kids. Many people could decide they want to have 1 or 0. Many people could decide they want to have 3. And those individual choices, if they added up to something like 1.4, 1.6, 1.8 kids per 2 adults, would result in a future of long-term global depopulation. It's not about fertility falling forever. A stable birth rate at a level that is common across much of the world now would lead to this unfamiliar future.
Because I want to say something like building on that, and it was a conversation we were having with Phil when he was walking in. I think that's part of what is this question of why didn't everybody see this coming, right? And one of it is we didn't have the demographic and health surveys back then, and sadly we don't have the demographic and health surveys now, and that's a big problem. A world with, or a society with an average of 1.8 probably doesn't feel that different to live in than a society with an average of 2.2. Like when you're going to the grocery store, running laps around the lake, going to the pool or something like that, you're going to see a lot of families with 2 kids, a lot of families with 1, a lot of people who don't have kids, some 3s and some 4s, and it's going to feel pretty similar. Now, it turns out that a stable birth rate at 1.8 is going to cause depopulation generation after generation. A stable birth rate of 2.3 is going to cause population growth, but you can sort of see why it just might not have been something that people were thinking about.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the most interesting things in the book, for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet. You show that these little differences that we wouldn't feel, actually when you do the exponential path forward, have really different implications for population.
But on the other hand, if it's 1.8 for the world as a whole versus 1.4 for the world as a whole, which of course we have no idea which of those it's going to be.
Yeah.
Either way, either of those would put the world on a path to depopulation.
Right. Okay. What about technology? So, a lot of people will say that AI, vaguely, our appeals to AI, are going to solve this, or maybe this is a good thing given AI in the sense that, well, AI is about to take a whole bunch of jobs. We didn't know what those people were going to do anyway, and so maybe given the AI revolution that we're on the brink of, this decline in population actually works quite well. The other way people, appeal to technology is as a solution to the fertility crisis, in the sense of, well, we're going to make breakthroughs in assisted reproductive technology, and so then that relaxes the constraint on childbearing years, and women will be able to have children for much longer. Or, much more optimistically from the technology sense, horrifyingly in my personal judgment, we're going to have artificial wombs, so that'll solve the problem. How do you all think of this issue vis-a-vis technological advancements?
Yeah. So that's an important question. It's one that we get a lot. I mean, could something like artificial wombs or sort of less imaginative forms of assisted reproductive technology, could that be the path to the world not depopulating? And I want to start by saying that, for a lot of people out there, assisted reproductive technology could make a big difference in their lives, could help them form the family they want, could help them in other ways achieve the things they want to achieve in their lives. In the book, you see sort of our own families' ups and downs trying to build the families that we wanted. And so, I hope that everybody gets the health care that they need. The question that sort of, if we're trying to think about at the population level, is what would that, would that be the path to avoiding depopulation? And I think, in the book we argue that, even imaginative examples, we take it one step further and say, what if there were a baby button? You push the button and you get a baby in your arms, and it's your baby to love and take care of all night and all day and all night and all day for years to come for the rest of your life. And you can sort of see by the way I put that, I think that would be a wonderful benefit for a lot of people. And I know that, my spouse and I would have pushed the button, and it would have been one of the happiest days of our lives. But are there really that many people who would have a different number of children? Because it isn't just, as difficult as pregnancy and childbirth and miscarriage and as much as important as that can be in people's lives, there is a lot more that people are thinking about when they're deciding what sort of families they want. And of course, when you look at something like the National Survey of Family Growth in the U.S., for example, you just don't see that there are that many. You just don't see that there are that many people sort of in their 40s who really want that many more children.
Yeah,
so perhaps
that's interesting.
not. Yeah.
And on the first part of the question, just very briefly about AI, I think this is another case where we really need to think seriously about the timing. So, global depopulation is not going to relieve us of our duties to confront climate change, because global depopulation isn't going to start happening for several decades after we should be making progress on climate this decade and the next. And in the same way, it's not going to interact with AI in the way that I think people sometimes think, because what's going to happen with AI is going to be very fast, potentially, the next year, in the next decade, in the next a couple decades from now. It seems like an infinite time horizon from now when it comes to AI. The population will still be growing in that time. So the idea that somehow there's going to be some happy coincidence between a globally declining population and AI, disrupting labor markets and putting, cohorts of people out of work, it just isn't going to line up in a way that I think sometimes people think, might be advantageous.
Interesting. Okay, I have lots more questions for you, but let me see if there's anyone in the room who wants to ask a question. Yes.
I gather that
Hold on for the mic, because we've got people on.
Thank you. I gather that sub-Saharan Africa is currently an outlier in terms of birth rates. To what extent are your projections dependent on what happens in sub-Saharan Africa? Is it a big enough part of the pie to really affect what is going to happen?
Yeah, so through the 21st century, our projections just use the UN World Population Prospects medium projections. So we just say, let's imagine that's what happens through the 21st. And then after that, we do our projections by sort of asking a very oversimplistic, but sort of being oversimplistic is the point. An if-then assumption of if the whole world goes to 1.6 or 1.8, including sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you're right. Sub-Saharan Africa right now has a birth rate of 4.3, so that's above replacement. It's also been falling there from 5 a couple decades ago, and 6 a couple decades before that. So, like everywhere else, birth rates in sub-Saharan Africa are falling. And one question is, when the demographers at the UN in their projections include that that it's going to continue falling in Africa to around 2, they would put it at the end of the 21st century. Why do they believe that, or why is that something that they consider likely? And I think a big part of it is that there's still a lot of room to grow for education, and especially female education and female literacy there. The sort of average female education and literacy in sub-Saharan Africa isn't so different from what it was in India in the 1990s, and the birth rate isn't so different from what the birth rate was in India in the 1990s. And that's certainly not, cause and effect, and it's sort of always difficult to understand if better educated people have fewer children, is it because of the education or because different people sort into different levels of education? But I think there is a lot of reason to think that, I guess, sub-Saharan Africa would have to be very different from other places for it not to be the case that as socioeconomic development continued, as there's more education, especially more female education, birth rates there continue to fall. And so I think that's probably what these projections have in mind. But yes, it's certainly the case that the population in Africa is projected to continue growing from around 1 billion now to around 3 billion at the end of the 21st century. And so the composition of the world will be a lot more African in 100 years.
I'm going to ask you this question from the YouTube channel.
Okay.
Who are the current researchers whose work challenges you the most, and which of their assertions are most challenging to your theory that stabilization is required?
I'm going to give a little bit of a cop-out answer, but maybe Dean can give a more direct answer. I think that this is, unfortunately, a fairly under-researched topic relative to its importance. We were talking earlier today about how you can find 100 papers on the impact of the earned income tax credit on labor force participation, but there isn't the same sort of groundswell, and that's important, and we should learn about that. There isn't the same sort of groundswell of research interest in these questions about long-term birth rates, long-term population change. Possibly that's because of a sort of like a terrible history of engagement between academics and the population control policies of the late 20th century, and the reaction to that, the sort of antibody response has been to say, like, whatever happens with the population, that's nobody's business. It doesn't matter if the population is bigger or smaller. It doesn't matter what birth rates are. All that matters is that people make individual decisions. And we completely believe in the book and in our lives and in our advocacy that people should be making individual decisions with the full choice of and the full set of reproductive options. But that just doesn't pin everything down, because people in different societies, exposed to different opportunities in different economic systems where there's different levels of conflict between education and career and family, they make different choices. And so I think to some extent, I don't have an answer of who are we disagreeing with in the population space, because there aren't as many people in the population space as there should be. But I guess to the extent we're disagreeing with anyone, we're disagreeing with the people in the population space who say, whatever the birth rate is, whatever the future path of population is, it's neither good nor bad, it just is what it is. And I think there's lots of reasons from history, from the understanding the macroeconomic growth that has lifted all boats, including and especially the prospects of lives for the poorest people in the world, to think that we should care about what the global population is, to think that we should care about the progress that people make. So that's where I think we're in most conflict with anyone in the population space. It's with the people who would say it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for this. Looking forward to reading the book. Turning to solutions, I loved what you said about making parenting easier. I'm happily married, 2 kids, and it is exhausting. Despite all the AI, I'm still reloading the dishwasher, doing the laundry. And I heard a statistic recently that now in the US, there are more people caring for older adults than school-aged children. How do we fix the care economy? What are your solutions for making parenting easier?
So I'll go ahead and give away the secret ending of the book, which is that that in the last chapter, what we say is we don't have all the answers. We don't have the solution, and it would be too early to start giving prescriptions for how exactly to address such a big, broadly shared global challenge that we see in different ways in countries around the world and that's been unfolding not just for decades but for centuries. But I say that, but we still wouldn't have written the book if we weren't optimistic that the future could be different, if we weren't optimistic that there could be an alternative to depopulation. And that's because we're so early in confronting this and asking what to do about it in a constructive and in a constructive and an inclusive way. I mean, I think, as you said at the beginning, like so many people still think that overpopulation is the most likely path, that unending population growth is the most likely path, let alone asking, is depopulation a future that we should welcome, or should we be working to stabilize the population instead? So I'm optimistic that the place to start is with considering the case for people and whether depopulation is the future that we should welcome. And as more people start to talk about that question, then decades hence, people will know more than we do about what to do.
I'm going to say, I appreciate your humility, but I actually think you guys have more to say about solutions than you let on, in the sense that you rule out certain solutions very clearly, right? You're very explicit in the book that the answer to this is not to restrict women's choices and opportunities. And I think that's really important, like an important part of your message, because there is one line of thought, and we see in some of the reporting on the pronatalist movement that there's, among some segments, the idea is, well, we need to get women back to just loading the dishwasher and taking care of people in the home, and that's what it's going to take. And you guys explicitly reject that, and I would say you come out, my reading of your book is affirmatively that getting society, not just men, but society, to share in more of the care burden has to be part of the response.
Yeah, it's certainly, a more widely shared, celebration of care work, social support for care work, I think will be part of the solution. Exactly, I think that's different from knowing, here's my 10-point legislative proposal that will turn things around. And I think it'd be part of a broader suite of changes. To this question of, a version of the question, does addressing this mean backsliding on gender equity or women's place in society? I think, very clearly the answer is no to us. And we were just talking about research that we each did independently, looking at slightly different measures, and just looking at comparing countries, which is not the best thing. It is not the highest standard of evidence, but it is a piece of evidence. If you just look across the world, where among advanced economies, where the gender pay gap is larger, where meaning women make fewer cents on the dollar relative to men, or you look at other measures of sort of gender equity in the workplace, or women's sort of full participation in the labor force relative to more of a home role, you just don't find any positive relationship in the sense of, fewer women in the workforce or more gender inequality leads to higher birth rates. That's just not the pattern. So it would be a terrible thing that we should not pursue, even if there were an association there, but there isn't an association there. So there's just reason after reason to think that that's not the way forward.
Yes.
Thank you. Really appreciate this conversation. I'd love to know, what are the young people saying, right? I assume you're on University of Texas campus. You get to talk to young people. They're the future populators. How are we creating that communication campaign with them, right? That 1968
conversation happening 2025 for the younger generation. We have a lonely academic for young men, right? And we saw that in the voting situation as well and the choices they were making. And so I think sometimes we hide behind some taboo conversations, but I think young people are willing to have them. So what are they saying, and what would you, or how would you talk to them about this conversation?
I'll give my answer. I think I have. So being college professors, we're talking with students all the time. These are students who are 18, 19, 20, 21. I feel like from that group of people, I hear less about things that would point to the loneliness epidemic. I'm not saying that that's not a problem, but I think for the people in college who are like living in communal quarters and partying on Friday and Saturday and Thursday and Wednesday and Tuesday nights, it's not exactly the thing that seems most relevant to them at that point in their life. But one thing that I do hear a lot from students is a sort of an adoption of the belief that people are bad for one another, not necessarily on the individual level, but on the social level, that another person added to the world means dividing up what the world can offer more thinly. And there's a lot of concern about environment, as Melissa pointed to at the beginning of this. And I think concern about the environment is good, and I'm glad that college students care about that. I think, unfortunately, there's also just a lot of misinformation about what an additional person or additional million people mean to environmental causes that they care about, whether that's climate or habitat loss or anything else. I mean, one thing that it just sort of confounds the stories that people usually tell. Dean told this one story about particulate matter air pollution in China decreasing as the population grew. But you find these sort of stories in all sorts of realms in environmentalism. So, even as the US population has grown by 100 million people, more than 50% since 1975, we are using less and less of land in the United States for agriculture because we're learning to grow more on smaller plots of land with less human labor, which means that there's less displacement. So there's just, I think there are these tropes that I think have really influenced young people, and some of them, some of these facts are right, and some of the things people say are incorrect. And part of, I think, what we're trying to do in the book is correct the record and think about how can we actually care both about the environment and everything else that matters, and also care about this issue.
Great. I think we're out of time, so I want to thank everyone for coming. Urge everyone to read the book. Go give it a good review on Amazon and Goodreads. I believe you both are willing to sign books if people want,
sure.
Right? And let's all continue this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.